Purple Robe here, and you have made it all the way to Chapter 4 of The Shadow of Shub-Niggurath. I know you're enjoying it. It's Cthulhu, it's Nazis, it's the war, World War II. I mean, it's great stuff. Again, the first 5 chapters are on YouTube. This is Chapter 4, so if you haven't heard 1 through 3, you might want to check those out first. Without further ado, enjoy the show. Henri Burke-Bricheaux rang his bell 3 short jingles and waited. He didn't have a chance to inform Samuel that there would be guests dining with him tonight. He had met General Walter Oberhulef at a pre-war party hosted by Eugene Schuler, the cosmetic magnate. Oberhulef was then the owner of an accounting firm that was attempting to do business with L'Oreal. Even then he was a devout Nazi, and when the party came to power, was approached by Hitler to oversee the finances of the Reich. It was quite a surprise when the old man noticed Henri, who was leaving the apartment of a mistress near Rue Royale. The general, innocently enough, had been going for a walk with his niece, who was newly arrived in the city. Henri couldn't recall her name from the afternoon meeting, but she was a striking figure in her Untersturmführer uniform, which she filled out quite nicely. Though Burke-Bricheaux had only just relieved himself of a bit of sexual tension, he felt the pressures building up again at the sight of this young officer. Oberhulef, who had also only recently come to Paris, was pleased to see a friendly face, and during their brief chat had invited himself and his niece over for dinner that evening. He seemed oblivious to the food shortage in occupied France, and spoke of looking forward to the delicacies that he'd enjoyed on his earlier vacations. Henri knew better than to refuse a Nazi general, and besides, he was far better off than most of his fellow Parisians, being wealthy as well as friendly with other rich men, who were rather snug with the enemy. For his own part, Burke-Bricheaux towed the socialist line half-heartedly, and did whatever he could to help his countrymen survive the ordeal until help came from abroad to free them all. So, on his way home, he attempted to call in some favors and pick up a few items for dinner. He had lent Monsieur Gerard, the baker, a bit of money earlier when his child had become ill and he couldn't afford a doctor. This turned out to be worth 2 excellent baguettes. Butter was another problem that unfortunately was not possible to solve on short notice, but he did have some preserves he could break out of the cellar. He had gotten Madame Adele a job in the production plant, but she had been one of the greatest pastry chefs in the world before there was no longer a market for pastries. Indeed, there were no ingredients to make them even if people could still afford to purchase them anyway. Fortunately, she was home even though it was a Wednesday, and marking his distress, was more than happy to quickly prepare something for dessert. Henri had brought over some figs, lemons, and a mango he'd been able to acquire, and in half an hour she had created figs sauterelles to pour atop some homemade lemon sorbet, which needed to be brought home and frozen. She instructed him to slice up the mango for an appetizer with a bit of sugar and cognac. If he used his meat rations for the whole week, he should have enough for dinner for 3. He got home about noon, and had Luc put the sorbet in the freezer with instructions for him to stir it every hour until it was to be served. It was Henri's job to give dessert enough time to chill properly by making the other courses last as long as possible. He left Luc in charge of preparing a main course, and then grabbed some cash and ran over to the Happy Fish to score some cognac and hopefully a good bottle or 2 of wine. The proprietor, who was a friend of Samuel's, had what he was after, but relieved him of all the francs he'd brought with him. The scoundrel. Finally, he'd gotten home, exhausted. He bathed, perfumed, and dressed before remembering the need to warn Samuel, his butler, of the coming festivities. Samuel had been with him for 2 years now. At 62, he was 10 years older than Henri, and to be honest, he wasn't a very good butler. "Where is that man?" wondered Henri irritably. "Can't he remember that 3 short jingles means danger?" Henri rose from his chair with a humph, and passed through the kitchen. Luc was busy at work, and it smelled lovely. Luc had been a chef for nearly a decade, and he wouldn't trade him for the world. "Have you seen Samuel?" "No," replied the cook, "but I can hear him. He's in his room." Henri rolled his eyes, and crossed the kitchen to the hallway leading to the servants' quarters. As he neared the closed door to Samuel's room, he could hear the low, deep snores of the old man. He entered quietly and gazed at the fellow who played his butler with near paternal devotion. Then he slammed the door behind him, causing Samuel to jump with such a start that he nearly fell out of the bed. "What? Who's there?" "Shush!" Henri stood at the foot of the bed with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for Samuel to get his sleepy bearings. "You need to learn to be more quiet when you are startled awake. What if I were a German soldier?" Henri spoke English to Samuel because even after 2 years living in a French household, the older man could still barely put together a coherent sentence in what was to him a foreign language. For 2 years, he'd been passed off as Henri's mute butler, but actually, Samuel Curwald Asher IV was from San Antonio, Texas. He'd made his fortune in the soap business, and when the war broke out, he felt the need to do his part by helping the Froggies kick the Krauts out of France. His good friend of many years, Henri, had tried to dissuade him of this passion, but once the Texan got an idea in his head, he could be as stubborn as an overbearing mother-in-law. How he'd made his way into Paris, Henri still had no clue, but he'd shown up at his doorstep in the middle of the night a few years back with that cocky, bearded grin of his, and had been with him ever since. He'd come with documents forged so well he'd been able to use his bread voucher the very next day. Henri explained the situation to Samuel, and told him that he must be on his best behavior in front of the general. "But I have a meeting tonight," Sam protested. No. Henri was still a little exhausted from running about today preparing for this evening, and he didn't need any hassles. He hissed back, "I've put you off for 2 years. You know your responsibilities. I need you for this dinner. Whatever your meeting is, and I don't want to know, I am sure they can do without you. The Marquis won't be liberating France tonight." The Marquis was the name of the resistance fighters in southern France. Upon his arrival in Paris, Sam had done his best to infiltrate La Resistance, and after a while he'd made a few connections. This part of his life was kept secret from Henri, who could get in enough trouble just for housing him. "And keep your voice down. Luke is in the kitchen. The guests should arrive at 6. Henri concluded, and left Samuel to get into his butler's uniform. Not even the cook or the chauffeur knew Sam's true identity, or that he was not a mute. Again, he didn't want to get anyone into any more trouble. The only ones who knew him as a crotchety old Texan were Henri, Tommy from the Poison Hero, and a few of the higher-ups in La Resistance. Sam took great pains to keep it that way. He wondered if it would be possible to get a message to Louis and CM to let them know he won't be able to make it to the meeting tonight. He'd been working on the explosives they desired for the offensive they were planning to coincide with the NATO attack. Sam was a chemist in his younger days and had pioneered the soap business. He discovered long ago that the principles of soap making weren't too different from that of bomb making. For this, among other things, he was a valued member of the French underground. It was not unusual for members to miss rendezvous for a variety of reasons. The worst was always feared, but most of the time those people showed up a day or two later unscathed. Lately, however, supporters showed up the next morning dead in an alley somewhere, strangled or shot. There was no way to tell who was responsible, but everybody knew. Still, other times, the particular person was never seen again. So they lived in constant anxiety, worrying about what the missing or dead person had told the Gestapo, or more specifically, if he'd named names. Sam began laying out his clothing for the evening. A general was coming to dine, and he wondered what sort of information might be acquired from him. That was Chapter 4 of The Shadow of Shub-Niggurath. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to hear more than the first 5 chapters that are up on YouTube, hit my Patreon page at the Purple Rope. Thanks.